If you're listening to this episode and you feel your ladder of escalation starting to shoot up, pause, go take care of yourself, touch grass, do whatever you need to do before continuing. The second disclaimer that I want to say is that nobody at Pet Harmony, including myself, supports the notion of buying e-collars and using them with our clients.
Welcome to Enrichment for the Real World, the podcast devoted to improving the quality of life of pets and their people through enrichment. We are your hosts, Allie Bender.
And I'm Emily Strong.
And we are here to challenge and expand your view of what enrichment is, what enrichment can be, and what enrichment can do for you and the animals in your lives. Let's get started. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Enrichment for the Real World. And I want to thank you for rating, reviewing, and subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. Hello and welcome to today's Q&A episode, e-collars. In today's episode, Emily, Ellen, and I talk about, obviously, e-collars and vibration collars and what's the difference, Nuance, and Emily's $1 million Shark Tank idea. Here it is. Today's episode, Q&A. E-collars. Okay, so several people have asked us a variety of questions about e-collars over the years, which tells us that a lot of people are curious on our stance about them because we don't speak in absolutes about e-collars or almost anything for that matter. So we figured it was time to answer that one big question that has come to us as a lot of little questions. And Emily, I know that you are very passionate about the subject. You have an entire diatribe on this. So I am just going to release the Kraken. You are the Kraken, and go for it.
I love it. Thank you. I'm here for that. So yeah, there are so many layers to this topic. So bear with me as I sort through them. However, the first thing I want to say just to start off, because I am aware of how heated this topic is and how many feels this topic can bring up for people and how concerning this topic can be. The first thing I want to say is take care of yourself. If you're listening to this episode and you feel your ladder of escalation starting to shoot up, pause, go take care of yourself, touch grass, do whatever you need to do before continuing. The second disclaimer that I want to say is that nobody at Pet Harmony, including myself, supports the notion of buying e-collars and using them with our clients because we do not believe in supporting an industry that profits off of pain and peddles quick fixes. So whether or not the collars themselves can be used appetitively or in a way that actually is enriching, to me is a secondary point, because the first point is the industry of producing and selling e-collars profits off of pain and sells their products as quick fixes to behavior. So from an ethical standpoint, I don't support that industry. I never will, full stop, right? So I wanted to get those first two things out of the way because I know that if I waited to say that, people would be feeling very anxious. So let's just start there. This is not going to be an episode where we are defending the industry because the industry itself is indefensible. Okay, but let's get into the dialectics, the nuances, the things that are important to know and think about in order to have a productive conversation about this tool. And I think a good place to start with this is to really sit with the idea of a cognitive bias called the affect heuristic. So the affect heuristic is when our emotions, our feelings about a topic skews our perception of the actual integrity of the topic. So how that affect heuristic plays into this conversation about e-collars is that people who are against them and who have seen the harm they cause and, like me, have big ethical complaints with the industry tend to overstate the risk of harm. And people who are proponents of e-collars and use them all the time and support that industry tend to understate the risk of harm. And The reason that that's important is because as humans, we tend to think in these all or nothing dichotomous mindsets of something is either safe or it's dangerous. It's a safe tool or it's an aversive tool. And that's not actually how tools work. That's not how anything in life works. Everything is on a spectrum of risk. And every tool that is used to manage dogs or animals in general has a potential to cause harm. Even tools that we like to think of as the safe tools or the better tools, front clip harnesses, can also cause harm. So, when we are looking at which tools we're going to use to manage a behavior until ideally we have been able to train a skill so that the animal no longer needs that management tool, we need to look at the risk of harm that that tool poses. And this is why that affect heuristic is so important, because if you have strong feelings either way, you're super pro e-collars or you're super anti e-collars, I can almost guarantee that your ability to do an objective risk assessment is compromised. So, this is why we're talking about this, because it is important to learn all of these details and dialectics so that we can be better at actually assessing the risk of harm in an objective way. The other thing I want to say about that is that a lot of people who are proponents of using tools that fall on the higher end of that spectrum of risk, that are more likely to be aversive, that are more likely to harm an animal's physical, behavioral, or emotional health. I've heard a saying or a phrase or an adage, whatever you want to call it, many times from people who support the use of those tools. And that adage goes, it's not the tool, it's the fool. And I just have to say, like, this really plays into this conversation a lot, because if you as a teacher are setting your student up to fail by putting a tool in their hands that needs extraordinary skill to reduce the risk of harm, then it's not the student who's the fool in that situation or that scenario. So I really think that we need to think about the whole picture, not just is the tool good or bad, but does the teacher know how to use the tool proficiently? Does the student know how to use the tool proficiently? Is the animal an animal that can receive this tool or learn from this tool with a minimum risk of harm? All of those things play into our decisions when we select a management tool to give to our clients while we are helping them to teach their pets skills so that they no longer need any kind of management tool whatsoever. So the speech that I have for my clients, the script that I use is, I want you to get to a place where ideally the leash is only there to comply with leash laws. And otherwise, your dog does not need a tool to be able to walk with you and stay engaged with you. So that is the script that I use. So, with all of that said, that is the context for this conversation. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about e-collars is that the only way they can work is by causing pain, that it is the painful stimulus that quote unquote works. And unless your goal is to entirely shut down the dog, which obviously is not our goal, and actually, most of the balance trainers that I have worked with and that I know, and some of them I'm even friends with, that's not their goal either. And they're very good at using an e-collar without ever shutting down a dog. But the unless that is your goal, which there are trainers out there who do use e-collars to just lay a dog out, right? And unless that is your goal, the painfulness of the stimulus is not actually the thing that works. So the reason that e-collars are effective, it's not actually about pain. It's because they are a tactile cue. And tactile cues do not lose intensity across distance, whereas auditory cues do lose intensity across distance, especially if the dog is producing their own noises. If the dog is yelling, they're going to be much less likely to hear an auditory cue from a football field away than they will to feel a tactile cue that is present with them. So, another thing that I think a lot of people who have never used an e-collar, have never had one in their hands, they've never felt it. A lot of people don't realize that the lowest settings of a good e-collar are far less intense than vibration. And the thing that I tell people who have never touched an e-collar before, if you want to know what the lowest setting of a good e-collar feels like, lick your fingertips and put your fingertips on the prongs of a D battery. And that's what the 0 setting on a good e-collars feels like. It's just barely, it's not even a tickle. It's like a whisper of a sensation. Like, I don't know how to describe the feeling, but if you want to know what it feels like, lick your fingers and put them on the prongs of a D battery. And that is the sensation that that lowest level on an e-collar feels like, which means that it's actually quite easy to create an appetitive stimulus pairing with that lowest setting because it is so far away from being aversive. It's just the barest whisper of a stimulus at all, that it's actually quite easy to pair the first few levels of an e-collar with an appetitive stimulus, so that we basically just turn that little tap on the dog into a cue to look at their handler. And that's how I've used it in the past. I will talk to you about the two situations in which I've used an e-collar and why I've used it. We'll get to that. But a lot of people don't realize that a vibration collar is actually more aversive than the lower levels of e-collars. And the two brands of e-collars that I have had experience with because my clients had them and wanted to use them, the vibration setting wasn't until level 10. So you have 9 levels below vibration that are less aversive than vibration. So when people think that e-collars by definition are intrinsically aversive, that is inaccurate. That is an inaccurate view of e-collars. You can turn e-collars into an appetitive tool. Again, I still am not a proponent of buying them because I don't believe in funding an industry that profits off of pains and peddling quick fixes, but it is possible to use an e-collar in an appetitive way where it's just a tactile cue that maintains consistent level of stimulus across distance as opposed to an auditory cue. So those beeping collars also don't lose intensity across distance because the sound stays with the dog instead of staying with the handler. But there are some dogs who do seem to respond better to tactile cues than auditory cues when they're really upset, or not even upset, but when they're really excited about something or very interested in something. So I do understand why clients have reported that e-collars were the only thing that was effective for their dog. I absolutely believe them. I do not doubt them at all when clients tell me that the e-collar was more effective. And it was not because the e-collar was painful, it was because it was a tactile cue.
So I just wanted to point out, like, as you're talking about, like, believing your clients and all of this, because I know we have a lot of professionals who listen to this podcast. So I just wanted to insert a little note here that when we are talking with clients who have used these tools and perhaps have used them in a way that we wouldn't prefer they be used, they're not using an e-collar in an appetitive way or in a positive reinforcement way, if that's an easier term to wrap your head around. It's really important that we honor the experiences that our clients have had with those tools, especially because what the problem that I see with many professionals is they go into that all or nothing thinking that, Emily, you were talking about in the beginning, where they're like, e-collars don't work. And it's like, well, that's just patently false. They do work in a variety of situations depending on what your goals are. And so when a client says, well, an e-collar worked to get my dog to stop barking, and a trainer says, well, e-collars don't work, it's like, okay, there's a whole lot more nuance that needs to go into that in order to be accurate, first of all, and to build a relationship with that client. Because if we come in saying that something that they have experienced is wrong, that's just getting a relationship off to the wrong start.
And I'm going to throw it back to Corinne's episode earlier this season, because she said something that has stuck with me every day since I've heard it. This is very on trend for our 2024 year, but it was going with questions, not statements. So when you have those things that you hear and you're like, oh, my chest feels tight, for me, my cue is that my thigh muscles clench, and that is my inhibition of my own flight cue. And those are the times where I'm like, oh, we should be asking questions, one, to give myself the chance to like process whatever is happening, and also because what was said probably is out of alignment with what I heard. And what was said is probably much more benign than the story that my funny little amygdala was able to spin in record time from those things.
Yes, I hard agree. And I have had clients, which we'll get to the clients who have already used them when they come to us in a little bit. But I have had clients who've said like, "Oh, the e-collar was the only thing that worked." And then when we talk about it and I'm asking them questions and talking about it in a way that is more objective and believing them and supporting them, then they feel safe enough to say, "We didn't like the emotional outcome that our dog had, but it did work to like get the behavior to change." So a lot of times people are coming to us like feeling conflicted already about e-collars, and so then if we add on like, "Oh, they don't work," or "They're bad," or whatever, we're just increasing the anxiety that they already had. So yeah, when people feel safe, a lot of times they do acknowledge like, "Don't love the way that it worked with my dog, but it did work." Right. So we'll talk in a little bit about how to help clients navigate that. But in that context, let's talk about the two clients that I've had that I have actually agreed to work with them with e-collars. And they were almost identical situations. So I'm just going to talk about them as if they were one client. So in Utah, being able to take your dog on off leash hikes through the mountains is treated as like a God given right. It is so deeply ingrained in the culture that most people who have dogs can't fathom life with their dog without being able to do off leash hiking in the mountains. So both of these clients were those people and they both had newly adopted dogs who were adults and were just learning life skills, and both of them had, one was a husky, the other one was a mixed breed but looked probably like had some houndy stuff, although we know that like you can't really tell by looking at a mixed breed dog what they actually are most of the time, but for the most part looked, I would feel safe guessing little houndy creature. So we have like both dogs had a tendency to just run and run and not really turn around. So they were both concerned that their dogs were high risk at not recalling. Both of them had been to other positive reinforcement trainers and had tried just like the sort of traditional methods that we teach recall. Both of them did not have good experiences. Both of them had been told by everybody and their neighbor, their mother, their everybody that they know that like e-collars were the way to go. Both of them had talked to their previous trainers about using an e-collar. Both of them had been shamed by those trainers. So they came to me very defensive already. They were like, "We are using an e-collar. Positive reinforcement doesn't work. If you won't help us with this, we'll go to just like a regular e-collar trainer." And I could see the defensiveness that this wasn't an ultimatum because they didn't care. They were ultimatums because they were feeling defensive because they had previously been shamed and had not been successful at just using treats for the recall the way we normally teach it. So with both of them, I talked to them about the fact that the thing that made the e-collar effective was that it was a tactile cue and that we could in fact do it without causing pain. The conversation I had with them is that while your dog is learning this skill, they're going to make mistakes because that is part of the learning process across species. We don't just come right out the gate being perfect at our skill. We are going to make mistakes. So when your dog makes a mistake, are you likely to want to crank that e-collar up and punish your dog? Are you going to want to use the e-collar to lash out at them if they make a mistake? One of the clients was horrified that at the thought of that. She was very, very committed to not hurting her dog, which is why she kept trying positive reinforcement trainers, even though she'd been shamed by them. And so she was like, "No, I don't want to hurt my dog. If there's a way to use an e-collar without hurting my dog, I'm committed to that." So we just had a conversation about not going above level 10. We're going to find the level of the tactile cue that her dog would make that stimulus pairing. The other client, the guy with the husky, was at that point, we had worked up enough rapport and trust that he was comfortable being honest with me and going like, "Yeah, I might want to crank up that collar." And I was like, "Cool. So if you do that, you're going to undo all the work we've done because this collar has to mean good things. And if it stops meaning good things or those good things become unpredictable and it could be either good or bad, we lose the efficacy of the e-collar altogether. So how would you feel about some antecedent arrangement for you?" I did not use the term antecedent arrangement with this guy. Okay. But I basically asked him, "So how would you feel about we super glue the remote at the level at which we're going to use it as an appetitive cue so that you can't get frustrated and crank the setting up?" And he was like, "Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, I love that because I'm going to try not to, but I might get frustrated." And I told him, "Our goal is that you never feel frustrated. Our goal is that we do this in such a way that you don't experience frustration, but we want to prepare for the worst because we don't always get to control everything that happens in life, especially when we start getting out into the mountains off leash." So we used the e-collars exactly as I described earlier. They had already purchased the e-collars. So again, I didn't feel the ethical quandary about funding the industry because the collars had already been purchased. I was not telling my client to go buy them. And we used the lowest settings, but the husky had thicker hair. So I think we were at a 4 with him. The houndy dog had less hair. So we were able to use a 0, and the hound very quickly did the stimulus pairing. And what I told them is that those pairings are very fast. If we don't get it in 5 repetitions, the dog probably can't feel the stimulus. So that's what we did. We started at 0. We did 5 pairings of tap, treat, tap, treat, tap, treat. If the dog didn't respond by the 6th time, we turned up the settings. So that's how we got up to 4 with the husky. We did not start at 4. And by the way, for those of you who are unfamiliar, these collars have like 100 settings. So 4 out of 100 is still incredibly low stimulus. Like I said, the vibration was 10 with this collar. So that's how we found the level that the dog could actually feel through their coat, and we paired it with food. And so it very quickly became tap means look at handler to get further instruction or to get a treat or whatever is going to happen. So that was how we used them. And what we found is that both dogs responded really well to the tactile cue and very appetitively. They would get happy and excited when they felt the tap. They would come running back to their handlers, and it all was happy and good. And they did not have any issues with the dogs being afraid or showing any kind of pain or anything like that. However, I still don't recommend that. And with our clients, we do not offer e-collars because they are high risk tools, and using those e-collars would be funding an industry that profits off of pain and selling quick fixes. So even though I have been able to do that twice successfully, that is still not my go-to. And I still don't recommend that as a regular strategy because the industry itself is problematic and we don't want to fund that. And because when we can teach clients how to effectively use auditory cues, more often than not, the overwhelming majority of the time, we don't need to go further than that. So I wanted to give that context because I would be lying if I said I hadn't used an e-collar. And also we had a very good, pleasant experience with the e-collar being appetitive. And also I still don't recommend that as a primary strategy. It should be a very last resort, in my opinion. I also want to say that I have heard multiple people in this field say that the only way to address dogs who have quote unquote high prey drive, which I don't really use that language to describe those set of behaviors, but I have heard people say that the only way to change or quote unquote fix high prey drive is to use an e-collar, and that's just simply not true. We deal with prey drive all the time. We have so many clients who exhibit those sets of behaviors, and we just have never needed to use e-collars for them. So again, this is about affect heuristic and maybe a little bit of those autoepistemic logical fallacies where we think because this is the only way I've been able to successfully do it, it's the only way that's possible or available. But we don't recommend using e-collars, even though we have been able to use them successfully and appetitively and in an enriching way.
So yes to everything Emily was saying. I'm going to throw in one little caveat, and that is for deaf dogs. We get asked frequently, I see this question asked all the time in like Facebook groups, the internet, and all of that. How do I train a deaf dog? And we often in those spaces give a flippant answer, which is you train them the exact same way you train a dog who can hear. And one of the reasons that we give that kind of flippant answer is because it's not the space to discuss what we would actually be recommending to a client, because I dislike getting roasted on the internet. So let's talk for a second about deaf dogs. So Emily mentioned that you can use an e-collar as a tactile stimulus. And really, when we're talking about a deaf dog who you can't use an auditory stimulus for, then our options typically go to a visual stimulus or a tactile stimulus. I have worked with clients who have deaf dogs where I have recommended a vibration collar for the reasons that Emily just said of I don't want to be supporting the e-collar industry. Yes, vibration collars are a subsection of that, and also it makes me feel better, and sometimes that's what you have to do for your little human brain. The other reason for that is they don't have the ability to crank it up if they want to, anything like that. What I will say though is that we usually have to do more work on the front end to make sure the vibration is not aversive, because some of like even the lowest setting on some of those vibration collars are, it's like those old school, y'all remember those like brick phones and like the vibration level of those old school brick phones where it was like your pocket was taking off? Like that's legit the lowest level on some of those vibration collars. And so we have to do a lot of work on the front end of that to make sure that the vibration isn't aversive. And then we can pair that with good things so that we get the effect that Emily is talking about of we feel that vibration, we're happy and excited and good things are going to happen. And we look at our human and we can do recalls and we can be out in the yard off leash and all of that fun sort of stuff. We can give a lot more freedom to those deaf dogs. But I did want to point that out here is one of the reasons that we at least give vague answers when people ask us about deaf dogs is because it's in a space where we are not able to talk about the nuances of using a tool that can have fallout attached to it if done improperly.
That's what it means to take a descriptive rather than a prescriptive approach and look at our learners and let our learners tell us what they want to do, what feels good to them, what doesn't. So, the way that we actually introduce vibration collars to deaf dogs is by wrapping a hand towel around the vibration part. And we start by teaching the dogs, or like with a lure or some kind of cue, depending on what the dog already knows, to walk into the collar itself, and then we pay. And because it's wrapped, we're basically reducing that sensation by wrapping it in the towel. And then when the dog is really eagerly walking into that collar, we'll take off a layer of the towel, do it again. When the dog's eagerly walking into it like that, we'll take off another layer. Usually I can only do 3 layers of a hand towel around a collar, but we take off that layer and then we'll drop the towel altogether and have the dog walk into the full vibration, and then we'll put the collar on the dog. So we go through a lot of really an operant process because the dog is choosing to walk into the collar, but the outcome or the byproduct of that operant process is a desensitization protocol that results in counter conditioning. And I don't think I've ever had a deaf dog who noped out of the vibration collar when we did it that way. And Allie's shaking her head. So same with you, right?
Every deaf dog I've worked with, I have ended up using a vibration collar for attention getting, and every one
Mhm.
of them were, by the end of it, were pleased as punch to be using that tool.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think that the idea that a vibration collar is somehow more humane is not necessarily true, and we can still introduce the vibration collar in a way that is appetitive. And I will tell you, it does not take very long to do it. Where the sanctuary where Allie and I worked didn't give us a lot of time to do things. We had to do things very quickly. Allie's face, for those of you who can't see it, just said, "That's an understatement." So the people who are concerned about it taking too long to do it appetitively, and I can promise you it really does not take very long. usually I could get through that whole process that I just described with the towel in 1 or 2 5-minute sessions, because usually that was all we were given at the sanctuary. So it is totally possible to do it, and it doesn't take very long, and it's worth it to have a communication tool with a deaf dog who then that gives them more freedom and allows them to go farther and be more independent and explore more things. But with either a vibration collar or an e-collar, the way in which that often goes south, like all our plans get messed up, is when people think that it isn't working and that the dog, quote unquote, needs an escalating stimulus. And not only is that not true, that's also a very human centric approach to behavior, because it's not actually taking the learner's experience into consideration, and we're not really investigating why it isn't working at that level. I think there's probably a false dichotomy involved in this way of thinking too, that people are thinking it should either work or it doesn't, and we need to bump it up. What we should be thinking instead is, there's something about this situation that's too hard for this dog's current skill set. So I need to help them get out of this situation, and we need to figure out what it is that isn't working, why this isn't working. And a lot of times it's just we gave the learner a test that was too advanced for their current skill set. We hadn't proved the behavior enough, or the dog was in pain, or the batteries died, or something. There's just so many things to investigate that don't involve assuming that it's the learner's fault and that they just need an escalating correction. So I think that is a really important kind of piece of this discussion, because so often I've heard people say, well, yeah, but even if you teach it repetitively, if it stops working, people are going to crank it up. And that has not been my experience, because we provide support for our clients and for their pets, and we're looking at behavior through an enrichment framework. So ultimately, the entire back and forth debate about e-collars is really just one gigantic red herring, because the question is not whether or not e-collars work. Of course they work by definition. If they didn't work, at least somehow, in some way, some of the times, people would not continue to use them, and they would not be the gigantic industry that they are. And the question is not, are they always harmful or not? Of course they aren't always harmful. Almost nothing causes harm 100% of the time. There have even been people who have survived skydiving accidents. So no, it's not a question of whether or not e-collars are always harmful. The actual question is, are they the best tool to effectively reach our goal while minimizing harm and maximizing welfare and well-being from the dog's point of view and also from the client's point of view? Do they work from the dog's point of view? Do they work for the dog, which is why we're here in the first place, right? And the answer is almost always no. They really aren't. That they really don't meet that criteria the overwhelming majority of the time. So there are just not very many situations in which I think it is a good idea to use e-collars. I don't think funding an unethical industry is the best situation, the best possible decision most of the time. However, the one thing that we have not talked about yet is the thing that we mentioned in passing earlier, and that is, what do we do when a client comes to us and is like, I want to work with you. I really love your approach. I don't want to hurt my dog. And also, I cannot stop using my e-collar. I will not stop using my e-collar. It is the only thing that works. It's the only thing that makes me feel safe. I'm not going to do it. So we've created a flow chart that we use internally with our team. And for those of you who are listening who are in Pet Pro, we have also given you access to this in Pet Pro. And that flow chart basically helps our team to navigate how to help a client who is insistent on using one of the management tools that has a higher risk of causing harm, which includes e-collars. And essentially what we're doing is first finding out, is this tool actually getting in the way of us being able to reach our clients' goals? And then there's a whole flow chart from there, because if we can see that it's not, then let's let the client keep their security blanket while we work with them to meet their goals. And then they might be more likely to relinquish their security blanket when we've given them actual tangible help, helped them reach their goals, establish trust, then they might be ready to relinquish those tools. And I will tell you that that flowchart is highly effective. I do recommend creating a process like that for yourself if you are a professional, because we have not had a client continue to use an aversive tool in the way that they were using it when they came to us by taking that approach. So we don't reject people who are using tools that we don't endorse, but we do help them to navigate it so that we are still meeting everybody's needs, the client, the pet, and our own needs. So I have an idea, and I'm going to give this idea out for free because I have zero interest in trying to develop this. But if anybody runs with this idea and makes millions of dollars, you can send me an inspiration fee, like a thank you fee. I'd be cool with that. But here's my idea. Create an e-collar that goes from 0 to vibration and have these collars sold with instructions on how to teach tactile cues appetitively and effectively. And if somebody makes that tool, I will give them all my money, because I think it would be so helpful for people to have at their disposal a tactile cue that is much, much harder to make aversive. Like, you'd have to work really hard to make a collar like that be aversive. So that's my idea. That's how we could solve this big debate. And if anybody wants to run with that, like, hey, just lob some of your profits at me and I'll be like, cool, thanks. All right, so that's where I stand on e-collars. Allie, Ellen, have anything else to add?
I'm just glad that this turned into an episode of Shark Tank where you're like, I will take a 5% stake in your company for my idea.
Yeah, what? I stand by that statement.
No, I, you know what? I'm here for it. I hope that that happens for you and our industry. Yeah, I think you've covered everything that was in my head about this. This just wraps up today's Q&A episode. I want to thank all of you for joining us for season 8, and we will be back at you in a few months with season 9. Thanks, everybody, and happy training. Thank you for listening. You can find us at petharmonytraining.com and at Pet Harmony Training on Facebook and Instagram, and also at Pet Harmony Pro on Instagram for those of you who are behavior professionals. As always, links to everything we discussed in this episode are in the show notes, and a reminder to please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. A special thank you to Ellen Yoakum for editing this episode. Our intro music is from Penguin Music on Pixabay. Thank you for listening, and happy training!